Berlin, February 1933. The International Automobile Exhibition. Adolf Hitler, freshly appointed Chancellor of the German Reich, stood before a crowded hall of industrialists and party officials, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a prophet announcing revelation. He raised his hand and declared the coming of motorization for the people, a promise that would transform Germany into a nation of drivers, surpassing the decadent materialism of Henry Ford's America. The crowd erupted in applause. Beside him, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels nodded with satisfaction, already calculating the narrative power of this vision. By May 1934, the German Automotive Industry Association had commissioned Ferdinand Porsche, the Austrian engineering genius, to design a vehicle costing less than 1,000 Reichsmarks, affordable for the average German worker. On December 29, 1935, Hitler himself, a man who possessed no driver's license, received Porsche's prototype at the Reich Chancellery. He circled the small, rounded vehicle with childlike fascination, running his hand along its curved fender. "This," Hitler proclaimed, "will be the proof of our industrial supremacy. This will be the car of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. The world will witness German genius made manifest. Join our community in preserving the memory of the brave men and women who fought in World War II. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with friends and family. Together we ensure their heroism is never forgotten." What Hitler did not know, what he could not admit even to himself, was that his people's car would never reach the people under his rule. The promise inscribed in the very name Volkswagen, the vehicle of the folk, would become one of the Third Reich's most cynical deceptions. The colossal factory at Wolfsburg, built with the savings of hundreds of thousands of German workers, would produce not freedom and mobility, but military vehicles and instruments of war, powered by the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners. The true Volkswagen would only be born after Hitler's death, rescued from ruin by the very democratic forces he despised. The numbers told a story of systematic betrayal before a single car rolled off the assembly line. Between 1938 and 1945, approximately 700,000 German workers enrolled in the Kraft durch Freude savings program, purchasing 5 Reichsmark stamps each week, pasting them dutifully into their KdF savings booklets. They collected a total of 380 million Reichsmarks, with 336,000 workers completing their full payment plans. The promise was simple. When your booklet was full, you would receive your KdF-Wagen, your ticket to the new Germany of Autobahns and weekend excursions. The reality was mathematically impossible and morally obscene. During the entire Nazi period, from 1938 until the factory's liberation in 1945, only 630 civilian vehicles were produced before war production commenced. Of these, the vast majority went to Nazi officials and the diplomatic corps. Not a single paying German worker received the car they had purchased. The mathematics of deception was precise. 700,000 promises made, 0 promises kept. When the war began in September 1939, the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg transformed entirely into a military production facility. Between 1940 and April 10, 1945, the factory produced 66,285 military vehicles. Of these, 50,515 were Type 82 Kübelwagen, the German answer to the American Willys Jeep, rugged utility vehicles that served across every front from North Africa to the eastern steppes. Another 14,265 were Type 166 Schwimmwagen, amphibious vehicles whose production peaked at 8,050 units in 1943 alone. The assembly lines that were supposed to deliver affordable mobility to German families instead fed the Wehrmacht's insatiable appetite for mechanized transport. The human cost was equally precise. Between 15,000 and 20,000 forced laborers worked in the Wolfsburg complex during the war years, eventually comprising approximately 60% of the workforce. In April 1942, the SS established the Arbeitsdorf concentration camp directly on factory property, a pilot project for industrial armaments production using concentration camp prisoners. 800 male prisoners were initially imprisoned there, engaged in construction work and manufacturing until the camp's dissolution in October 1942. The factory later became officially designated as a subcamp of Neuengamme concentration camp. In 1944, a Volkswagen plant engineer traveled to Auschwitz and personally selected 300 skilled Jewish metalworkers from the massive Hungarian transports, while 650 Jewish women were transferred to assemble military munitions. The promise of a people's car was built on the backs of enslaved peoples. Ferdinand Porsche was not a Nazi ideologue when Hitler summoned him in 1934. He was a 59-year-old engineer with an unmatched reputation, the designer of the revolutionary Egerlohner electric car at the turn of the century, the creator of racing vehicles that had dominated European circuits. His engineering philosophy emphasized simplicity, reliability, and functionality. When the German Automotive Industry Association first commissioned him to design an affordable people's car in 1934, Porsche approached the project with characteristic thoroughness. His team worked in secrecy at their Stuttgart design studio, producing technical drawings that revolutionized automotive design for mass production. The result was a rear-engine air-cooled vehicle with a distinctive rounded shape, designed to seat 5 passengers comfortably while maintaining a low production cost and exceptional fuel efficiency. The prototypes underwent brutal testing regimens. By June 1936, 3 V3 prototypes had completed over 50,000 kilometers of testing across German roads, from the Autobahns to rural mountain passes. On July 11, 1936, Porsche personally drove 1 prototype to the Berghof, Hitler's Bavarian mountain retreat at Obersalzberg. Hitler emerged from his residence, studied the vehicle with intense focus, and within hours offered Porsche a contract to finalize the design with full state backing. The fact that the final cost had risen to 1,450 Reichsmarks, well above Hitler's target of under 1,000, was conveniently ignored. Propaganda would bridge the gap between promise and reality. Between 1936 and 1938, 30 hand-built prototypes were constructed by Daimler-Benz, each subjected to grueling pre-production test runs designed to identify weaknesses and reduce maintenance costs. The engineers drove these prototypes relentlessly, recording every mechanical failure, every component breakdown. By 1938, the design was finalized. A 2-door, 5-seater vehicle, powered by a 25-horsepower, 4-cylinder, air-cooled rear engine, capable of sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour. The engineering was brilliant, a testament to Porsche's genius, but the context in which this genius would be deployed was already corrupt. On May 26, 1938, Nazi dignitaries gathered near Fallersleben in northern Germany for the ceremonial laying of the factory's foundation stone. Hitler himself attended, delivering a speech that positioned the Volkswagen as the material embodiment of National Socialist ideology. The factory would be the largest automobile production facility in Europe, a cathedral of industrial might rising from the German soil. The planned city that would surround it, initially called the City of the KdF car and later renamed Wolfsburg, would house the workers who would build these vehicles. It would be a model National Socialist community, organized around collective labor and racial solidarity. The propaganda machinery of Joseph Goebbels immediately incorporated the Volkswagen into the Nazi narrative. Here was proof that National Socialism cared for the common worker, that it could deliver material prosperity alongside spiritual renewal. The contrast with American capitalism was emphasized relentlessly. Ford produced cars for profit. The Reich produced cars for the people. The KdF savings program was launched with massive publicity. Workers across Germany were encouraged to purchase stamps, 5 Reichsmarks at a time, pasting them into specially designed savings booklets. When a booklet was filled, it would be redeemed for a vehicle. The program was administered by the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the German Labor Front, the Nazi organization that had replaced independent trade unions after their suppression in 1933. The symbolism was explicit. German workers would save collectively, sacrifice individually, and be rewarded by the benevolent state. Hundreds of thousands enrolled. Factory workers, clerks, teachers, and civil servants across the Reich dutifully purchased their stamps week after week, imagining weekend drives with their families, picnics in the countryside, mobility, and freedom. The savings booklets became tangible symbols of hope in a society increasingly regimented by totalitarian control. But even before the war began, the promise was hollow. The factory that was supposed to produce hundreds of thousands of affordable cars was instead being designed for flexibility, for conversion to military production at a moment's notice. The massive industrial infrastructure rising at Wolfsburg was never intended solely for civilian purposes. When war erupted in September 1939, the pretense ended immediately. Civilian production of the KdF-Wagen ceased. The assembly lines were retooled. The Type 82 Kübelwagen entered production in 1940, followed by the amphibious Type 166 Schwimmwagen in 1942. These were not cars for Sunday drives. These were tactical military vehicles, designed for combat conditions, for desert sand, and Russian mud. The Kübelwagen was mechanically derived from the Type 1 design, using the same rear-engine, air-cooled configuration that Porsche had developed for the civilian vehicle. But its body was utilitarian, angular, designed for rapid production and battlefield durability. It could carry troops across rough terrain, transport supplies, serve as a reconnaissance vehicle. Between 1940 and April 1945, the Wolfsburg factory produced 50,515 Kübelwagens. They served on every front where German forces fought. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps used them extensively, their air-cooled engines proving more reliable in desert heat than water-cooled alternatives. On the Eastern Front, they navigated the primitive roads and vast distances of the Soviet Union. They were not as robust as the American Willys Jeep, which was produced in numbers exceeding 640,000 units, but they were effective enough to become essential to Wehrmacht logistics. The Schwimmwagen represented a more specialized engineering achievement. Production began slowly in July 1942, with only 150 vehicles completed by year's end. The first 125 were pre-production models, tested extensively before full-scale manufacturing commenced. In 1943, production accelerated dramatically. 8,650 Schwimmwagons were built. In 1944, another 5,475 rolled off the assembly lines before Allied bombing damaged the production facilities in June. The official end of Schwimmwagen production is often cited as November 1944, but evidence suggests limited production continued into early April 1945, with chassis numbers exceeding the commonly quoted total of 14,276 vehicles. These amphibious vehicles could transition from land to water, their propellers engaging to cross rivers and lakes. They were used extensively on the Eastern Front, where rivers and marshes were tactical obstacles. But they were also resource-intensive to produce, requiring skilled labor and specialized components that became increasingly scarce as the war turned against Germany. That skilled labor came increasingly from slaves. The Arbeitsdorf concentration camp, established on the Volkswagen factory grounds in April 1942, was not an aberration, but a deliberate integration of the concentration camp system into industrial production. The camp was a pilot project for the SS, testing the viability of using concentration camp prisoners for armaments manufacturing. 800 male prisoners, drawn primarily from political prisoners and criminals in the Nazi classification system, were housed in barracks within sight of the factory halls. They were marched under guard to construction sites, where they built additional factory infrastructure, prepared sites for planned aluminum foundries, and performed heavy labor. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were subjected to corporal punishment, food deprivation, and arbitrary violence by SS guards and civilian overseers. Those who failed to meet production quotas or were accused of sabotage faced transfer to Penal Camp 18 or the Labor Education Camp 21 near Salzgitter, facilities notorious for torture and murder. The Arbeitsdorf camp was disbanded in October 1942 when the Reich Ministry of Armaments and Munitions declined to approve Volkswagen's plans for an aluminum foundry at the site. But this did not end the use of concentration camp labor at Wolfsburg. Instead, the practice expanded and became systematic. By 1943, as German manpower was increasingly diverted to military service, forced laborers became the majority of the factory workforce. The categories of coerced labor were diverse: prisoners of war, particularly from the Soviet Union and Poland; Ostarbeiter, civilian forced laborers deported from Eastern Europe; concentration camp inmates; and in the final years of the war, Jewish workers selected directly from the killing centers. In 1944, as the Hungarian Jewish community was deported en masse to Auschwitz, a Volkswagen plant engineer traveled to the camp and personally selected 300 skilled metalworkers from the arrival ramps. These men, who had escaped immediate gassing because of their technical expertise, were transported to Wolfsburg to work in the factory. Simultaneously, 650 Jewish women were transferred to assemble military munitions in a separate section of the factory complex. The official relationship between the Nazi concentration camp system and Volkswagen was formalized when the Wolfsburg facility was designated as a subcamp of Neuengamme concentration camp. The factory complex ultimately contained 4 concentration camps and 8 forced labor camps, a sprawling archipelago of exploitation. The daily reality for these workers was one of systematic dehumanization. They lived in overcrowded barracks, often without adequate heating, sanitation, or medical care. Their food rations were calculated to maintain minimal working capacity, not health or dignity. The factory's own plant security, working in coordination with the Gestapo, maintained surveillance and enforced discipline through violence. Sentries and patrols controlled not only the factory premises but also the camps and surrounding areas, ensuring that any attempt at escape or resistance would be met with swift and brutal punishment. The catalog of punitive measures was extensive: beatings, solitary confinement, starvation rations, exposure to the elements, and arbitrary execution. The factory that was supposed to symbolize the prosperity of the German worker was, in reality, a site of industrial slavery on a massive scale. The German workers who had purchased their KdF savings stamps watched this transformation with varying degrees of awareness and complicity. Some genuinely believed the propaganda that their cars would be delivered after the war, that their sacrifice was temporary and necessary for national survival. Others understood, with growing bitterness, that they had been swindled, that their savings had financed not their own mobility but the Wehrmacht's war machine. But there was no mechanism for dissent, no independent press to expose the fraud, no political opposition to demand accountability. The totalitarian state had eliminated all channels of complaint. The workers could only continue purchasing their stamps, maintaining the fiction of the savings program, even as Allied bombs fell on German cities and the military situation deteriorated. Ferdinand Porsche, for his part, remained deeply involved throughout the war. He was not merely a designer who handed off blueprints and walked away. He was an active participant in the militarization of his creation, overseeing modifications and advising on production processes. His complicity was technical and managerial, not ideological in the manner of a true believer, but complicity nonetheless. After the war, Porsche was arrested by French authorities and imprisoned for 20 months on charges related to war crimes and collaboration with the Nazi regime. He was eventually released without trial, but his reputation was permanently complicated by his role in the Third Reich's industrial machinery. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany increasingly targeted industrial facilities, and Wolfsburg did not escape. In June 1944, U.S. Army Air Force bombers struck the factory complex, damaging the Schwimmwagen production line and other critical infrastructure. The raids killed workers and forced laborers alike, the bombs making no distinction between German civilians and enslaved foreigners. But the damage, while significant, was not total. Much of the factory machinery survived, covered by debris that factory managers deliberately left in place to disguise the fact that key equipment remained operational. As the war entered its final phase in late 1944 and early 1945, production slowed but did not cease entirely. The last Kübelwagens were assembled on April 10, 1945, the final day of the war at Volkswagen Beetle, just days before Allied ground forces arrived. When British forces occupied Wolfsburg in mid-April 1945, they found a factory that had been simultaneously destroyed and preserved. The buildings were damaged, the workforce dispersed or fleeing, the administrative records in chaos. The immediate question was what to do with this massive industrial complex. The Soviet Union was demanding reparations, including the dismantling and shipment of German factories to the USSR. British military planners considered demolition, viewing the factory as a potential future threat if Germany were to rearm. But one man saw a different possibility. Major Ivan Hirst was a 28-year-old Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers officer assigned to inspect the Wolfsburg facility in August 1945, with a view to converting it into a WWII workshop for British occupation forces. Hirst was an engineer by training, a man with practical instincts and improvisational skills. Walking through the damaged factory halls, he discovered that much of the production machinery had survived intact. Debris had been strategically placed over critical equipment, particularly the generator plant, to disguise its operational status. In outbuildings, Hirst found additional machinery, spare parts, and crucially, a pre-war prototype Volkswagen. He realized immediately that the factory could be restarted, not for military purposes, but for civilian vehicle production. The British occupation forces desperately needed reliable transportation across occupied Germany, and the devastated German economy needed employment and economic activity. Hirst drafted a proposal and submitted it up the chain of command. The arguments were pragmatic, not sentimental. Producing vehicles at Wolfsburg would provide mobility for British military administration, create jobs for German workers, and potentially generate export revenue. On August 22, 1945, the British military government issued an order for 20,000 vehicles. 2 weeks later, a second order followed for another 20,000. The dormant factory was officially revived, now under British military management, designated as No. 2 WWII Auxiliary Workshop. The challenges were immense. Post-war Germany was in chaos. Raw materials were desperately scarce: steel, batteries, textiles, glass, rubber. Supply chains had collapsed. Transportation networks were destroyed. The currency was worthless, but Hirst proved to be a master of improvisation. He persuaded British military authorities to allocate critical materials from military stocks. He established barter relationships with other occupied zone authorities, trading finished vehicles for raw materials. He organized the workforce, bringing back German engineers and skilled workers who had fled or been displaced. On December 27, 1945, less than 8 months after the factory's liberation, the first civilian Volkswagen left the assembly line. It was a moment of profound historical irony. The car that Hitler had promised to German workers was finally being delivered, but by British military authorities overseeing a democratic reconstruction. The factory's future remained uncertain for several years. British car manufacturers, including representatives from Humber and other major firms, were invited to inspect Wolfsburg and consider taking over production. They universally declined, dismissing the Volkswagen design as too primitive, too Germanic, unsuitable for British or international markets. The vehicle does not meet the fundamental technical requirement of a motor car, one British evaluation concluded. This rejection, which seemed like a condemnation at the time, would prove to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in automotive history. Under Hirst's management, production steadily increased. In 1946, Dr. Hermann Munch was appointed as the plant's managing director, the first German civilian to hold significant authority in the post-war factory. Munch and Hirst worked together to improve quality control and streamline production processes. The vehicles produced in these early years were rough, often assembled from scavenged parts, but they were functional and increasingly reliable. By 1948, when Heinrich Nordhoff was appointed as general manager, the Wolfsburg plant had 8,700 employees and was producing vehicles at a rate that astonished observers. On October 8, 1949, the British military government officially transferred trusteeship of Volkswagen Werk GmbH to the West German government, completing the transition from Nazi armaments factory to democratic commercial enterprise. Join our community in preserving the memory of the brave men and women who fought in World War II. Subscribe to the channel. The workers who had purchased KdF savings stamps during the Nazi era did not forget their claims. Beginning in the immediate post-war period, Groups of former savers organized and filed legal claims against Volkswagen, arguing that they were owed the vehicles they had paid for. The litigation dragged on for 12 years, a complex legal battle complicated by the dissolution of the Reich, the establishment of new German states, and questions about corporate continuity and liability. Finally, in October 1961, a settlement was reached. Former KdF savers who had completed their stamp booklets would receive 600 Deutsche Marks credit toward the purchase of a new Volkswagen. At the time, this amounted to approximately a $150 credit on a vehicle that cost $2,300. It was a fraction of what they had paid in real terms, a pittance compared to the betrayal, but it was at least an acknowledgement of the fraud. Wolfsburg, December 27, 1945. A German engineer named Otto Höhne stood on the factory floor as the first civilian Volkswagen, painted in drab military green because no other paint was available, rolled slowly off the assembly line under British supervision. Höhne had worked at the factory since 1939, had witnessed the transition from the fantasy of the people's car to the grim reality of military production. He had watched forced laborers shuffling under guard past his workstation, their eyes hollow with hunger and fear. He had kept his head down, performed his duties, told himself that survival required complicity. Now, in the cold light of defeat, surrounded by British soldiers who spoke a language he barely understood, he watched this vehicle emerge and felt a complex wave of emotion. Shame, relief, irony, and something approaching hope. Major Hirst approached, clipboard in hand, inspecting the vehicle with professional thoroughness. Höhne wanted to speak, to explain, to justify, to apologize, but he had no words. How could he tell this young British officer that the car they were now building together, the car that bore the same basic design as the prototypes from 1938, was supposed to have freed the German people? That hundreds of thousands of his countrymen had paid for these vehicles with their hard-earned wages, believing the promises of their government? That instead, their money had purchased Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens, vehicles that had carried Wehrmacht soldiers across occupied Europe, that had enabled a war of extermination? Hirst nodded with satisfaction, marked something on his clipboard, and gave Höhne a brief, professional smile. The British officer had no illusions about what this factory had been, what it had produced, whose labor had powered its assembly lines. But he also understood something that transcended moral judgment. This factory could be redeemed, not through forgetting, but through transformation. The car that Hitler had weaponized as propaganda, that the Nazi regime had turned into an instrument of exploitation, could become exactly what it was originally promised to be: a vehicle for ordinary people, a symbol of mobility and freedom. Höhne understood in that moment that history had broken and been reborn. The people's car would finally be delivered, not by fascism, but by democracy, not by masters to subjects, but by free enterprise to free citizens. The irony was so complete, so total, that it approached a kind of justice. The final accounting of the Volkswagen under Nazi rule is a ledger of systematic deception, written in precise numbers. Between 1938 and 1945, the Third Reich produced approximately 630 civilian KdF-Wagens before war production began, and exactly 0 were delivered to the 336,000 German workers who had completed their full savings program. The 700,000 total participants in the KdF savings scheme collectively contributed 380 million Reichsmarks to a program that delivered nothing. The Wolfsburg factory, built with those workers' money, produced instead 50,515 Kübelwagens, 14,265 Schwimmwagens, and an array of military armaments including components for V-1 flying bombs. The promise of mass mobility became the reality of mechanized warfare. The human cost was calculated in lives destroyed and labor exploited. Between 15,000 and 20,000 forced laborers, comprising approximately 60% of the wartime workforce, maintained production under conditions of systematic brutality. The 800 prisoners of the Arbeitsdorf concentration camp, the 300 Jewish metalworkers selected at Auschwitz, the 650 Jewish women assembling munitions, and thousands of Ostarbeiter deported from Eastern Europe were the true builders of Hitler's automotive vision. Their labor was extracted through violence, their humanity denied, their suffering uncompensated during their lifetimes. Ferdinand Porsche, the engineering genius whose designs made the Volkswagen possible, died in 1951 at age 75, his reputation forever complicated by his collaboration with the Nazi regime. He never publicly expressed remorse for the use of forced labor in the factories that built his designs, though his imprisonment by French authorities in 1945-1946 suggested that Allied powers considered him culpable. His technical legacy endured through the Porsche Automotive Company founded by his son, but his moral legacy remained contested. The redemption of the Volkswagen, if such a thing is possible for an object so entangled with atrocity, came through its mass production in democratic societies. Under British military management from 1945 to 1949, the Wolfsburg factory transitioned from armaments to civilian production. Under West German management after 1949, production exploded. The Volkswagen Type 1, now marketed internationally as the Beetle, became one of the most successful automobile designs in history. By the time production finally ended in 2003, more than 21 million Beetles had been manufactured across multiple continents. The car that Hitler promised to 700,000 German workers and delivered to none was eventually sold to tens of millions of people worldwide in democratic societies where individual choice, not state propaganda, determined consumption. The transformation was total and paradoxical. The vehicle designed to symbolize National Socialist ideology became an icon of 1960s counterculture in the United States, decorated with peace signs and anti-war slogans. The car, engineered to demonstrate Germanic racial superiority, became popular in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, transcending the racist categories that had defined its origin. The product of a totalitarian state's propaganda machinery became a symbol of individuality, quirkiness, and freedom. History had delivered its verdict not through punishment, but through ironic reversal. The people's car, denied to the German people under fascism, became genuinely the world's car under democracy. Hitler's automotive vision, stripped of its totalitarian context and reborn through Allied intervention, achieved its promise only by utterly repudiating its creator. The Volkswagen's greatest success was its complete liberation from the ideology that spawned it. The Volkswagen Beetle is one of history's most iconic cars, but its origin story is darker than most people know. In this documentary, we explore how Adolf Hitler and Ferdinand Porsche created the KdF-Wagen, strength through joy car, in 1930s Nazi Germany as a propaganda tool, promising affordable mobility to 700,000 German workers who paid into a savings program. Not a single civilian ever received their car. Instead, the Wolfsburg factory used forced labor from concentration camps, including the notorious Arbeitsdorf camp, to produce over 50,000 Kübelwagen and 14,000 Schwimmwagen military vehicles for the Wehrmacht during WWII. Discover how British Major Ivan Hirst saved the factory from demolition in 1945, transforming it from a symbol of totalitarian exploitation into the birthplace of the world's most beloved car. This is the untold story of how democracy rescued Hitler's people's car and turned Nazi propaganda into a global icon of freedom, selling over 21 million units worldwide. Honor the sacrifice of WWII's heroes by subscribing to our channel. These soldiers gave everything for our freedom. The least we can do is remember them. Like and share this video to spread their incredible stories.